Climate change has become one of the biggest issues around the world in recent years, but it's been a particularly big issue within Indigenous communities for the past number of decades, where particularly in Arctic communities, people have been experiencing already the impacts of climate change, for a number of years, really going back to decades now. Climate change in particular has been recognized as a threat to a lot of Indigenous cultures around the world, really threatening their basic existence and their prospects for future survival. From communities in the Arctic who are threatened by the basic disappearance of their lands, the basic disappearance of their territories being wiped away into the ocean, to communities, for example, in the Amazon, who are threatened with basically losing out their entire ecosystems, having them turned into deserts, to Pacific Islanders who have their potential for their islands to be completely washed away. Climate change is not just an idle threat for Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities around the world. And particularly with the recent negotiations that we've been seeing at the United Nations and other levels, there's been a lot of other concerns that have really brought Indigenous peoples to those negotiations to really try and speak up and have their voices heard. In particularly, it's not just been the fact that Indigenous peoples are going to be impacted by the effects of climate change, but also that Indigenous peoples are one of the main recipients of some of the primary pollution that causes climate change, and that refers to the fossil fuel extraction industry, the extraction of oil and gas, which happens predominantly in a lot of Indigenous territories in different parts of the world, and in Canada especially, with looking at the tar sands in Alberta. The third element there is that Indigenous peoples are also some of the communities that are becoming most impacted by the so-called solutions to climate change, which we'll talk about in a bit. But I want to focus on the fact that here in Canada, in addition to being the recipients of some of the worst impacts of climate change in Canada, this is all taking place on a legacy of continued colonialism within the Canadian context. Something that really sets apart Indigenous communities from a lot of other communities and leaves them with a low ability to really adapt, to really respond to these changes in the way that a lot of other communities are able to. And as a result of this, there's been a lot of pushes by Indigenous communities to really have their voices heard and to really say, you must listen to our communities, you must listen to our peoples and listen to what we have to say. And so in the recent number of years, Indigenous peoples have not just been talking to governments, have not just been talking to NGOs, but have actually been going to the United Nations, have been actually going to other international events and saying that we want to be heard, this is what we have to say, and we're prepared to stick around and tell you guys basically listen to us. Because what's happened is basically been that Indigenous voices, Indigenous experiences have been excluded from these conferences, has been excluded from the mainstream talk about climate change, which has reduced it to a very much scientific, very much technical level, and left out the experiences of basically frontline communities who are experiencing the worst impacts already, and allowed for the creation of basically improper solutions, basically false solutions, solutions that don't really get at the root causes of climate change. And so what we've seen from coming out of the UN, coming out of countries like Canada, United States, and others, have been basically models that have been pushing business as usual, and ones that have been saying, we're not going to really do anything about climate change, but we're going to basically try and sell you guys something that talks like a duck, but doesn't really walk like a duck. And these are often put under the framework of market mechanisms. Clean development mechanism being the first example of that, carbon offset programs, and most recently we have the project for reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. And there have been a number of other attempts to do very similar things. We have attempts currently going on towards geoengineering. In the past we've heard about biofuels. We also hear about mega dam projects. All these kind of things, all really go back to the same issue. They're not just real solutions to climate change, but they threaten actual Indigenous communities with either being kicked off of the land, with restricting access to natural resources, to animals, or even threaten basically the continuity of their culture by outlawing certain practices. For example, gaining access to forests and having access, for example, to all the lifestyles that a lot of forest peoples around the world basically depend upon. As a result of which, Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities at the UN have actually taken up to protesting recently a lot of these agreements, a lot of these negotiations, and in response have actually started to host their own sort of agreements and push for their own kind of solutions. And there have been two major examples of this. One has been the Alaska Declaration that was put together in 2009 when over 400 Native people from around the world came together in Alaska for a number of days and said, this is what's wrong with the planet, this is what's wrong with the climate, and this is how we want to see the planet changed. And then most recently, in 2010, in Bolivia, we had the Cochabamba Conference and the Cochabamba Declaration, in which tens of thousands of people, mostly indigenous from South America, participated and came up with a declaration that called for very much the same things as the Alaska Declaration and went into a lot more detail, but basically along the level of recognizing that the current economic system, the current systems of production and consumption, and economic exploitation of people around the world are all basically flawed and broken. And as a result of these systems being broken, we have a broken climate. We have really a lot of people around the world suffering from the hunger crisis, water crisis, energy crisis, all these different kind of crises around the world are really all coming together right now. And really saying that what we really need to do is think about solutions, is think about real long-term alternatives that will basically guarantee the rights of indigenous communities, but also guarantee the livelihoods and sustainability of all of our communities, all of our societies around the world. And that's why we feel it's really incumbent upon everyday Canadians, other people around the world, to really be the ones who step up and take responsibility for this and understand that at the end of the day we're all connected and that what we do impacts us all.